Back in his childhood, Jack witnessed a monster devour his family while they were at summer camp, causing him to develop significant anger issues as he grew. But when he decides to consult a psychotherapist, Jack unexpectedly meets a monster again, which turns out to be his professor. Will he think about channeling that rage into a successful strategy to defeat it? Let's find the answer in the movie. In the present day, monstrous cyclops suddenly appear in the village located in the African jungle. The monsters begin to assault every forest dweller, causing Jack Brooks, the monster hunter, to prepare his hunting equipment and defeat them all quickly. But before that happens, a flashback brings back his memories of how he became a hunter. In his adolescent years, Jack jogs around the field after his soccer practice but stops when his coach shouts his name. Jack then approaches him, only to learn he is getting in trouble again after whipping the ball at his teammate's head. Unfortunately, Jack suffered from aggressive behavior while growing up because of childhood traumas, and despite his reasoning that he never intends to hurt anyone when he gets angry is not a viable excuse. Jack's coach orders him to apologize to his teammate despite explaining that he only did that because he got elbowed by him. His coach believes that hurting people is not the key to resolving issues, especially if talking can fix it without getting into retaliation. This pisses Jack off, yet he has no choice but to sincerely apologize to his crying teammate in front of his coach. Afterward, he returns to the communal baths feeling enraged for being forced to admit the actions he only did to protect himself. He gets occupied with his thoughts while walking, causing him to stumble after accidentally bumping into his schoolmate. Because of that, Jack loses control again with his anger issue and takes the monoblock on the floor to break it but stops when the bell rings. That being the case, Jack was doing fine when he was a kid until he witnessed his family getting devoured by a monster, giving him trauma. Back in Jack's childhood, he and his family used to camp overnight in the forest. His parents dance merrily as their favorite pop jazz music plays on the radio. Seeing them, Jack decides to dance with his sister, Cindy, and teach her some moves. But it seems like Cindy does not listen to him as she gets hyped to the music to the point that she lets go of his hand and dances alone. Cindy then spins around when suddenly she gets into a shadowy area where she sees a forest troll. This prompts Cindy to shout for help, but it is too late because the forest troll quickly takes her away. Meanwhile, Jack and his parents hear Cindy's screams, and his mother attempts to rescue her, but the forest troll is too powerful. It also attacks her mother and mercilessly devours her. Upon seeing the condition, Jack's father fights against it to save his wife, but the forest troll pushes him away with ease. However, Jack's father is able to get up quickly and grabs the wood stick on the ground to beat the forest troll. He then repetitively hits it, only to get pushed again and weakened. On the other hand, the stiffened Jack witnesses his family getting killed, unable to move because of fear and shock upon seeing a monster. Because of that, Jack's father, who was already getting devoured by the monster, tells him to run and hide to save himself. Hearing his father's words causes Jack to hide behind the tree quickly and then run farther from the area. Returning to his adolescent days, Jack enters the council's office. He realizes earlier that breaking a monoblock will not calm him, and the only answer to his anger attack is to discuss it with Counselor Silverstein. Although it is evident that Counselor Silverstein is starting to feel frustrated dealing with Jack, he has no choice but to help him. He permits his assistant to let Jack enter and stops what he is doing. Once inside, Counselor Silverstein reminds Jack that he should have called when he plans to visit. So Jack makes excuses by saying he only stops in since he is going to Walmart, saying that it has been a long since his last session. He thinks Silverstein wants to know what is going on in his life lately. Counselor Silverstein then nods and asks about his condition. According to Jack, he is still working as a plumber and got persuaded by his girlfriend, Eve, to take a night class. He is doing good lately, especially in controlling his anger issues. But Counselor Silverstein refuses to believe him when he sees a bandage wrapped in his right arm and asks what happened. Because of that, Jack starts losing control again as he admits everything to Counselor Silverstein. It happened when he was at Wong's restaurant, wherein the owner favors him to fix the toilet hole in exchange for a bunch of egg rolls. Therefore, Jack accepts the owner's favor and fixes it, but when he heads to his van to go home, the owner confronts him, saying that the toilet hole exploded. The owner gets mad and blames him for what happened, causing Jack to get angry and almost punch his face. Hearing Jack raises his voice while speaking makes Counselor Silverstein let out a sigh. He wants to stop Jack from talking, but he knows it will only frustrate him. When Jack finishes talking, Counselor Silverstein does not comment on his story. This makes Jack feel embarrassed, and he leaves the office instead. Later at night, Jack attends his science class despite being aware that he is half an hour late. Upon entering, all the students glance at him, and then, out of nowhere, Professor Crowley gives him the order to turn on the lights as they just finished watching a documentary. Jack then does so and casually walks toward his assigned chair. Eve asks him where he has been by writing it on the paper. But instead of answering her, Jack crumples it and listens to the discussion of Professor Crowley. Professor Crowley begins tackling the lesson first before demonstrating, wherein he introduces the use of sodium. He asks his students what sodium is, but only Janice volunteers a response. So Professor Crowley lets her and proceeds to demonstrate the creation of the chemical reaction of sodium metal and water. He puts the small storage container containing water with a sodium chloride metal block in the cabinet and puts it on a table. Afterward, Professor Crowley informs his students that sodium can be malleable and reacts explosively with moisture. He starts his demonstration in which he cuts off a tiny piece of a larger metal block of sodium and drops it in the water. This makes the students stunned upon seeing a small explosion and gives Professor Crowley a round of applause. After the successful demonstration, Professor Crowley dismisses them. Jack and his classmates are about to leave the room, but Jack stops when Eve confronts him for consistently being late since the classes start. Eve gently prompts him to strike a better work-life balance by reminding him that, as a partner, he is responsible for picking her up from school. Jack tries to make amends by apologizing, but Eve refuses to accept it and orders him to drive her home instead. As they talk, their classmate suddenly intervenes and attempts to hit on Eve by offering to send her home. This pisses Jack off as the boy also mocks him for being Eve's irresponsible boyfriend, but before Jack even loses control, Professor Crowley calls him. Because of that, Jack has no choice but to let the boy drive Eve home and stay in the classroom to talk with Professor Crowley. Once alone, Jack learns that Professor Crowley is requesting a favor to fix the pipes in his house since he is a plumber. After Jack learns his address, he tells Professor Crowley that he will come by later since it is only a 20-minute drive from school. A while later, Jack safely arrives at the location and is welcomed by Professor Crowley. He examines the surroundings first and realizes that Professor Crowley recently purchased the house. The house has a bad history, yet he still buys it because of its low price. Afterward, he and Professor Crowley go to the basement to see the obstruction in the pipes. Thankfully, Jack quickly figures out the problem, which is that the main line is probably clogged because the pump has been shut off for so long. The rust inside the pipes makes the water hard to flow. Jack favors Professor Crowley to go upstairs and waits for his call when Jack needs him to test the newly repaired sink. Once alone, Jack immediately removes the clog and replaces its valve with a new one. He then switches on the pipe machine and tells Professor Crowley to try the sink. But it seems like it fails as Jack suddenly sees the water gushing from the machine right after Professor Crowley opens the faucet. He attempts to switch it off, but the rusty metal switch box eventually blows up. This causes Jack to panic since he has no idea how to stop the pipe machine from blowing off. He only watches it break, causing him to accidentally get injured after the valve breaks away from the machine. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Jack accidentally uncovered something from the ground, which is connected with the pipe machine. When Jack screams out of pain, Professor Crowley quickly goes downstairs to check on him, so Jack tells him what happened. He admits to Professor Crowley that he failed to fix it because the clog is all over the place and the pressure switch shorted along with the switch box. Therefore, Jack suggests that he replace some parts of it, including the valve. Professor Crowley hands over the payment to him, but Jack refuses to accept it and says he has no plan to charge his teacher. Crowley, overcome with appreciation, thanks Jack, tends to his wound, and lets Jack return home. However, when Jack leaves, an unknown force from the backyard enters the house and suddenly possesses the sleeping Professor Crowley. Professor Crowley begins to lose his mind as he gets controlled by the unknown force. The following day, Jack visits Counselor Silverstein again to seek help to control his anger issues. He also apologizes for the surprise visit he made last time, which Counselor Silverstein forgives and tells him to find a relaxing method. But it seems like Jack is getting angry again as he dislikes hearing the word relax from Counselor Silverstein. Because of that, Jack decides to walk out of the office and slams the door. Meanwhile, Professor Crowley awakens and finds himself lying in the backyard with his bare hands full of soil. Having no memory of what happened to him last night, Professor Crowley deduces from the surroundings he spent the night digging as he sees a small hole in the ground. Out of sheer perverse curiosity, Professor Crowley grabs a shovel and continues to dig until he comes across a large crate. He then uses his vehicle to pull it out and takes it inside the house. Afterward, he cracks it open, discovering a human skeleton and an invincibly beating heart despite being wholly separated from the bone. Initially intrigued, Professor Crowley then becomes frustrated by its high heart rate and tries to wreck it. But the unharmed heart rams its way into Professor Crowley's mouth and down his esophagus, knocking him unconscious. On the other hand, Jack enters the hardware store and goes to the counter to order a spare part of the valve. He takes the broken one out from his pocket to show it to the old worker man, Howard, who suddenly gets shocked upon seeing it. Howard asks Jack where he found an old valve, to which Jack answers that he plumbed in the old house on Watson Road. Looking in fear, Howard warns him that it is cursed and danger lies in that old house, but Jack refuses to believe. So Howard changes the subject and instructs him to come back the following day to pick up the repaired valve. Later at night, Professor Crowley regains consciousness and suddenly feels his stomach growling due to starvation. He then quickly checks the fridge and finds some meat he could devour before attending class. After a while, the students get shocked upon seeing Professor Crowley entering the classroom, looking tousled and wearing improper attire. Although they try to communicate what is going on with him, Professor Crowley seems completely possessed and does not answer properly. He only talks to himself and draws something on the board that is unrelated to his lesson. This prompts his students to worry, but he only tells them he is starving and continues to throw up on the board before dismissing the class. When Professor Crowley returns home to find some meat again, he learns that his fridge is out of stock of meat, causing him to look at his dog and decide to devour it instead. The following night, Jack returns to the hardware store to pick up the valve and discuss the cryptic warning Howard talked about yesterday. Howard then begins relating the tale, explaining that he and his uncle Emmett once resided in the same house that Crowley currently owns. Emmett was an antiquities collector who purchased the whole heart from an old shop. The intact heart is an unknown evil force that took control of Emmett and turned him into a raving madman. Just like what is happening to Professor Crowley, it was Emmett who appeared to be the first victim upon which Howard became a witness. It happens at night when Howard awakens from his dog's growl and decides to check it in the backyard, only to see his Uncle Emmett devouring the dog and attacking him afterward. Fortunately, Howard escapes from him and obtains the rifle inside the house to kill his uncle. Upon burying his Uncle Emmett, Howard suddenly hears the heart still beating inside it, so he decides to leave the house for fear of becoming the next victim. But Jack still refuses to believe his story despite having dealt with monsters as a child. Even after Howard's final warning not to return to Professor Crowley's house, Jack only ignores it and grabs the valve before leaving the store for his night class. When Jack reaches the school, he waits for Eve to arrive so he can repent for his recent actions, but she rejects his apology, and Jack ends up breaking up with her. Afterward, Jack enters the classroom when suddenly he encounters a girl whom he has been eyeing since the first day. This prompts Jack to attempt to have a long conversation with her, but Professor Crowley, whose face is swelling even more, already arrives. Because of that, the students start to feel scared, especially when Professor Crowley pushes his student who offers to help him get into the hospital. Eventually, Professor Crowley transforms into a monster with giant tentacles teeming from his back. The students quickly leave the room to escape, but Professor Crowley's tentacles manage to capture them, except for Jack, Eve, and the injured girl they helped. They keep themselves safe in another room down the hall, where Jack barricades the door so Professor Crowley's tentacles cannot enter. Meanwhile, back in class, most pupils are killed by the malformed, tentacled monster Professor Crowley. Since his body is immobile, he uses his mandible tongue to spit out a toxic black liquid that can transform the students into muscular troll-like monsters. He gives them an injection in their mouth and sends them off to capture more of their classmates. Jack, Eve, and their classmate get shocked when the troll-like monster manages to break the door and attack them. Although they attempt to fight it, Jack and Eve realize that it is too strong. Therefore, they decide to let their injured classmate and the janitor in the hallway get killed so they can escape. Once outside, Jack and Eve quickly enter the van, and Jack starts maneuvering it but stops when he hears the radio play a remarkable song. It is the song that was playing while he witnessed his family getting slaughtered by a monster during their camping trip in the forest. This causes Jack to not flee again and instead harnesses strength from his anger issue to fight the troll-like monsters inside, especially the deformed Professor Crowley. Jack returns inside and throws out Eve, who refuses to join him in saving their classmates. He grabs his plumbing tools as his weapon and begins fighting against the two troll-like monsters in the hallway alone. Even though Jack gets beaten by the third monster, he still manages to defeat it. Afterward, he grabs the axe out of the emergency box and heads to the classroom, where he faces Professor Crowley and his classmates. However, Jack discovers that his accumulated strength is no match for Professor Crowley's tentacles. So he uses the full block of sodium metal and throws it directly to Professor Crowley's head after recalling their earlier lesson. As Jack watches Professor Crowley's head blown off, one tentacle unexpectedly manages to save itself and quickly attacks Jack. Because of this, Jack double-checks Professor Crowley and sees that his heart is still beating, meaning his body is still active. So, Jack picks up the axe lying on the floor and viciously slashes his heart to cease the fight. The movie ends with a revelation of Jack choosing his new life to be a monster slayer in the African jungle, whose vision is to kill all the trolls and protect the forest dwellers from harm.